This is the 1970 Martha's Vineyard Cabernet Sauvignon from famous Martha's Vineyard on the Oakville Bench. First single vineyard labeled Cabernet Sauvignon in Napa Valley's history. Started in 1966, so incredibly significant both for vineyard and vintage. And unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of these left, but awesome to be able to drink it today.
That's right. We one less now.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
It'd be just my luck. I totally destroyed this cork. He used to be a sommelier. Now I'm just a desk jockey. And we were talking earlier how, this is the era where it was more important what was in the bottle than how heavy your bottle was.
That's correct.
Not a lot of wines in wooden boxes and things like that. Right?
I know. I still believe that what's in the bottle is more important.
Right, I agree.
To tell you the truth.
Yeah. But it's like now, it's like they weigh your bottle. When it comes out the table. Okay, I think this is good enough.
Yep.
When I first arrived to take over the state, Galen and I went through and he says, I think we should taste through some of the old vintage and really talk about, can you sort of taste when the different eras were? And there's always that thing of like, who knows when David took over from Joe and
right.
That sort of thing. And Joe was such a great storyteller that I'm sure he had maybe 4 different stories going about how David took over, There was the 1974 vintage when he broke his leg.
1974, yeah. That was the year that I remember for sure that David was out there on the crush pad.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he grew up here, no?
Yes.
Yeah. And when did your dad start working with Joe?
We started in 1970.
Oh, really?
Yep. And we started at the tasting room property, what we call the Highway Ranch, and then we moved up and worked on this property here. Was all planned to Gringolingo at the time.
Isn't that crazy? You think of like the per acre at this point with the land values to think that you would plant Gringolingo.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. But there's even like down at the highway, we had that variety as well as there was a block of mixed blacks back down there.
Really?
Yeah, all on the south side of the ranch.
I think that's something that very few people know about the Napa Valley is that that move to Cabernet, which is like the big Cabernet tide that came in, especially after the Paris tasting.
Well, that's for sure. I mean, it was typically people would have many different varieties or have a walnut orchard off the side to hedge their bets because it's farming.
What effect do you think the Paris tasting had on this rush to plant more Cabernet Sauvignon?
In my view, I know that the rush was actually before the French tasting. I think the French tasting pretty much finished off all the orchards.
Okay.
To be honest, yeah. I mean, the cows pretty much went out to other areas in Napa County, and they weren't in so much the Napa Valley proper per se. So,
because you and I talked about a very famous winery in Rutherford that used to be a cow pasture.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Now sells $180 bottles of wine.
Exactly. And actually, even down the street, there was, there's cows everywhere. In fact, one of the wineries up the street on the Sorrel Trail used to be the locker at that point, and the store was in town in St. Helena, which was called Keller's at the time, where they butcher the cows there on the Sorrel Trail, and you talk about, fresh meat. There you go. Wow.
Yeah.
God, it's still going.
Like really still going.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, cheers.
Cheers. Still got fruit showing.
Yeah, quite a bit.
Wow.
We talk about ageability of Heitz, and obviously I think that's one of the things that Heitz has really been known for is ageability, and I think that a lot of it rests on acid, proper acid. It's like the skeleton of the wine, it's the structure. It just keeps it going. Like the fruit profile will change and all these other things change, but the acid always just like keeps the palate fresh.
Right.
And it keeps everything really, really vibrant.
And it's still showing.
Yeah.
Yes.
But also like the long aging, I think that's something that went away. Heitz being one of the few that still does that really long élevage before they bottle the old school style.
Yeah, I mean, that changed because there was a lot of wineries, more in that 4 or 5 year ball aging, and you're right, a lot of them moved down to more getting the wines out in 18 months or within 2 years for sure.
And these ones
for Cabernets.
Yeah, but it's a huge commitment to do that. I would say that like you would be far pressed to try to start a new winery and do that kind of élevage with the amount of money tied up. And it's been really interesting to see how we both know this. I learned it just from being around the valley and meeting people and talking to people and reading these manuscripts about Joe's reputation. For, I guess we can say, for lack of a better word, he was pretty stern in his beliefs.
He was.
And he didn't suffer fools very well.
Nope.
So
he would correct you. He would correct you too.
Yeah, really funny. When I moved here, I found a new therapist, and I go into the office and we're talking. She says, "Well, where are you working?" And I said, "Well, I was really fortunate. I was hired to take over and run Heitz Cellar." And she goes, "Yeah, Joe was such a jerk." My therapist says this to me. It's like everybody knew it, but where I think the estate benefited from that was that they didn't change a whole lot. They didn't wiggle with trend and with things that came in. They sort of said, well, I understand there's trends and tastes have changed, but like we sort of like it this way, and this is how we're going to do it.
That's right. He stayed true to course.
Yeah.
Honestly, and I mean, it might be from his BV days or whatever, but he did stay true to course.
The style has been roughly the same for a very long time. And the more I read about Andrei Telechev's philosophies and seeing how we make wine here, you can see a lot of Telechev's influence on Joe, given his time working with him at BV.
Yes.
I mean, BV was the cat's meow.
At the time.
At the time, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. That's for sure. They owned a lot of property.
Yeah.
And they had some great properties, actually, between Rutherford and Oakville. And of course, everybody started moving towards Canaris and stuff like that, especially with the French tasting with the Chardonnay planting. That's when Canaris started were taking off. And the once, $500 an acre cattle land became, the farmers became rich and famous got rid of the cows and sold their properties.
Here we have this tasting that put Napa on the map. I mean, I've read the stories of, those that were in that room scoring those wines, afraid of losing their jobs and trying to sue people to get their notes back and things like that.
Right.
Because it was such a big deal. But then all of a sudden Napa changes, starts changing things. They start quickly. They start, they had this incredible program down. They knew how to plant, they knew how to make the wines. And then somehow, even though they were getting this notoriety, there was this weird insecurity where they felt they had to now copy Bordeaux, and they were,
Yes, and of course, the French came here and like Opus and made a stakehold too, right? So, and then they brought their type of vineyards and their trellis systems and et cetera.
We admire the structure of Bordeaux in old Napa, and sometimes we forget how it was made. People don't simply just go back and go, okay, how do they train these vines? How do they farm this? How do they make these wines to get this result? They sort of want to emulate it by copying Bordeaux, but Bordeaux is it's a cold, rainy, overcast place with very little sun. Napa is warm, fairly dry, and very, very sunny.
That's correct, and that's why they have the grapes so low to the ground, so they can get that heat to get that rush for maturity.
We still have people that look at the Napa Sprawl, and they'll go by our vineyard in Rutherford and go what is that sort of thing, and then they taste the wine. Yeah. It's it isn't always pretty manicured rows that make the best wine. We're looking for freshness in wine, and that's why I always drew me to these wines. And I was never fortunate enough to meet Joe before he passed away. But reading his manuscripts, and luckily we have these 100 and 150 page manuscripts of interviews with him, and he really stresses there's he didn't mind having a little bit of weight in the wine, but it had to have acid too as well.
Right, that's correct.
Was super important. So looking at the transition from here, because this is obviously the 1970 vintage, we have the 1976 tasting. What did you see were some of the biggest changes, late 70s, early 80s?
Well, I would say that when the tasting was done, pretty much all the walnut trees and prune trees were done, and so were the cattle, for say. Like I said, and vineyards went in, and the two varieties, it was a two-variety show. It was Chardonnay and Cabernet, and sometimes the Cabernet wasn't planted in the right spot.
Yeah.
It should have been Chardonnay if you're going to have those two choices. As a farmer all my life, when phylloxera came back around on the mutation of phylloxera and vineyards were pulled out, I thought, well, that's almost a blessing, because some of these varieties should have been planted there in the first place. Sure. So I think that the valley got sort of trued up more in correctness of the right varietals and the right soils. Really, in the late 80s and early 90s when that phylloxera came in. And But that's also when a lot of VSP hit the valley pretty hard.
Yeah, so vertical shoot positioning, it's a trellising method, vine training method that's really built around like exposing the canopies up like big solar panels and opening up the fruit zone so it's really fully exposed to sun, like really fully exposed.
Which you would need in Bordeaux.
Correct, in a place that doesn't get a lot of sun.
Or maybe more up north, like in Oregon or Washington, for say.
It's a cool to cold climate vine training method. And when you're in the Napa Valley, where we do get heat spikes, it's never been a cool region ever. Really the goal is to get enough sun, but not too much, right? It's really the goal. Get enough rain, but not too much. It's really the key to I think great viticulture. And vine training is a really powerful tool. It has a massive impact on the style of wine. It's really hard to produce this style of wine with fully exposed grapes. It's very, very difficult. Hence the reason that you started seeing things like shade cloth come around, which if you're on the old Napa sprawl, it's natural shade cloth. But then you see this VSP sort of north to south, and you see these grapes just being cooked, especially on the hillsides.
Yeah, because when we were younger, it seemed like the heat of the day was more that 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and now it sort of lasts, when we do get those heat spikes, it lasts longer into the 6 o'clock hour. And and one of those big things, like you mentioned, the solar panels, each leaf is a solar panel because they're straight up.
Yeah.
Versus, the sprawl, or Geneva double curtain, those type of, once the shoots get long enough, they flop over and they're not producing as much sugar.
And it sort of shuts things down.
It shuts it down a little bit.
And people have, it's pretty ideal for the valley floor where if the soils are a little bit more fertile, you need to, and you taught me this, carry a bit more fruit to balance out the vine. I think that in my opinion, 100 years, when we look at the significance of that parastasian, I'd imagine at the time it probably didn't carry a whole lot of weight, right away. And I'm sure just over time, people really started to understand the significance of what that actually meant. And more importantly, it was because of the people who were judging the wines. And that's for me what was the significance of it. There's one thing to have your countrymen telling you how great you are.
Right.
But to have at that time, which was, Napa Valley was looked as a sort of backcountry wine region that was fourth tier, and France had held tight into that, that place is the greatest wine country in the world. And here you have the elite of that nation. Those estates are still the elite, rating our wines above their own.
And we were on their turf.
On their turf.
That's right.
In Paris.
That's right.
With, the who's who from Burgundy, Bordeaux, and so forth, so on.
Exactly.
And to me, that's it's about as pure as you get.
No, I know. And I would probably have to say that, what really was a driving point is all of a sudden the huge demand for Cabernet and Chardonnay.
Yeah.
And all the walnut tree orchards and the growers that had all these orchards and cows. Oh my God.
Yeah,
so it was really.
And the poor Petit Syrah Alicante Boucher didn't stand a chance.
Oh man, there were so many different varietals that were here.
Yeah.
You'd be amazed. It was just it was really fun to actually see all these varieties when I was a kid and understand them. And, because as we've been narrowed down to still very few varieties in Napa Valley. But today, I'm sure it would be a huge celebration due to the fact of how Napa Valley is today and versus I think it was more that the growers are celebrating because, wow, everybody really wants some Chardonnay, some Cabernet. And I was lucky because I planted it in 1970 or 71, right? I'm already in production.
Yeah, you're I just want to sell at that point. During this era, when this wine was made, the farmers had it figured out. And as things progress, it was that generation after generation that they even though, we obviously dominated this tasting, it was we came back and there was this inferiority complex where we now needed to go and take inspiration from all over the world, and they changed things. And now we're going back and going, well, maybe we did have it right, duh.
Yeah, it's like the little hamster from the wheel sometimes, And I've, in my lifetime, I've seen, well, didn't we just do that? And of course, some of the things they go, Oh God, that was like 40 years ago.
Yeah.
in my case, right? So it's pretty funny. Also, it's like, oh my God, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing you're seeing more cask aging, and these young winemakers are very intrigued by these older wines and going like, how are those made? And you start seeing bigger, casks and ovals being used to age in lieu of a whole lot of new oak and things like that. And it's just sort of the pendulum swinging a little bit back in that era. And the unfortunate part is, I think that there are very few people still around who understand how these wines were made. I wish you could be a fly on the wall in some of those cellars and tables where you had, Telechev and Martini and Joe and Bob Travers and all those guys in the same room figuring it out, talking, like this. And some of them did. Like Joe was very highly educated.
He was.
He wasn't just a gunslinger. Like he had a lot of degrees. He was well studied. Everything here was still new, and they were figuring it out. In hindsight, they sort of nailed it. I mean, you grew up around Joe and his family a lot. What was Joe like as a kid, like growing up around?
He was stern, but I mean, I grew up in a family business, so I mean, so I don't know what was the best of two evils sometimes between my dad and Joe, because they got along really well. And my dad was, again, he was a little bit military as well, and we were brought up sort of, not to say I had to salute him every morning, but
sure. Close to.
My dad was like Joe, they would never say like, hey, that great job. My dad would say, like Joe, well, there was a dinner plate for you, right? You know what I mean? So you just have to understand Joe. I mean, and of course I was a lot, I was very young, working here and driving tractor. And I remember one time he goes, how old are you? And I go, he goes, he just looked at me and I kept on driving, I said hello. And so it was,
I said the same thing when I saw your kids when I first got him. I'm like, how old is that kid? And he's like, I mean, he's literally just like ripping up ground, with like a tractor. I'm like, who is kid? Like, he's like 15 years old. I'm like, yeah. They're like, yeah, he's 15,
Yeah. No, I started all my kids out early too as well. But, and I think that's a great asset for farming, and being in the blood. But, I mean, even during the wintertime, when there was not much to do, I mean, I would, help Joe out here and, he goes, oh, can you do this over here? And so next thing I'm doing some of the landscaping and doing the stuff. And we, as you know, we do pretty much a lot of things besides tending the vineyards for y'all. But he would correct people. I don't think there was anything wrong. Sometimes the way he might have said it might have been, a little fun.
Not a great bedside manner.
Not really.
No.
But
yeah. I was when I first took the job, I did a lot of traveling. When I was on the plane, I would read through these manuscripts, and you see these stories where he hated people abbreviating the word Cabernet Sauvignon.
And, I've seen it many times.
Yeah,
where he corrected people,
and he would just rip people. And there was a story where, he's doing this interview, and the guy asked him, he goes, Joe, really what was the driving force behind really committing Heitz as being a cab house or a cab winery? And he goes, a cab is something you put your arm up and hail in New York City.
That's right.
Cabernet Sauvignon is a grape.
That's correct.
And like completely deadpan. If you look at the manuscript, it just period. Like he just sort of like left it for this guy to like, another story, he would they love to host here. And I'd read all these stories about, him and Alice hosting people for lunches, and for the people they liked, they treated like family.
Royalty.
Yeah.
Seriously,
And
yes.
he would have these small groups, and they would come through, and he would taste. And if someone were to be talking while he was talking, he would just completely stop. And then go completely silent and just, are you finished? And if there's any way to convince people probably not to come back or buy your wine, but I don't think he cared. I think there was enough people who wanted the wine where, he's like, this is my craft. This is my life. Like, you're gonna respect this, he just didn't suffer fools.
I think Joe's integrity was a strong point, and it shows in everything he did, right down to his wines. And I think that when he didn't release a wine, it's integrity, right? And it's I think that says a lot about his character.
Yeah.
And yes, there was the one-liners that you would think it was a joke, which it wasn't, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's something I grew up with. And
how do you think Joe would have done in like some of today's like more commercial tasting rooms with the bachelorette parties with the sundresses coming through and doing the tastings?
I don't think there'd be a red room, no. But I think again, I think his style is I mean, you got to look at when he built from the old cellar over here,
Yeah.
and that was in the 70s. And that's quite a building because, if you've got to really go back to what we're talking about, these wines that were chosen. It was really old school wineries, and there wasn't that many wineries in the first place, that met that criteria, right?
And also, if you look at the personalities and the people who were running them, they were real wineries and real winemakers. This wasn't flash. These were not hobby winemakers. It wasn't like, I just made $100 million in Silicon Valley and I'm just gonna get a summer house and buy a $20 million estate. These people were, they worked with great farmers. They were vignerons. It was their lives.
And they were the owner, and like Joe, he was actually in the winery making the wines.
Yeah.
His integrity, I think, it really stood out for my part, with him, and how he stood, we're at the point where let's just not pick and rush. Let's pick once ready, and if we have to wait, and we'll work with Mother Nature, we'll wait, And that was old school winemaking versus all the tools we have today that we're working with, and we take, the old school winemaking with the new tools, and we're trying to dovetail them together, and it's really, in my life where I'm at, and I've seen the old school stuff, and I'm seeing with all these new tools, it's fun, but also I can see where I think you've got to bring them together, because you really can't go, these are all new tools, let's just go with that, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's really interesting when I've been really fortunate to sit down and talk to Warren Warnowski a few times, and we don't really talk about the Paris tasting. What we talk about is what the culture was at that time versus what it is today, and he really puts an emphasis on the attention to detail that they needed back then, because they were building their reputation, right? I think that so often people take for granted the Napa Valley and the value that it has, right now, and what they inherited, right?
Right.
Like, he's like, Carlton, we used to have bungs that were wood, and we would have to line up the grain of the wood on the bung with the barrel, so that, he's like, we were to that T, like super precise, and we were winemakers. He's like, we were fully committed to our craft,
Right.
And he's like, well, today it's like, people take that for granted and they sort of commercialize it. But these are real winemakers. I think we're going back to that connection to owners being fully operational, and I think it makes a very different commitment to the wine. But I think it's really interesting seeing, again, Joe, and like looking at 1970, and if you were to taste, the 2014, you'd probably find something very similar. You know what I mean? And that's
2014 is beautiful.
Yeah, and like so many years later, keeping that consistency. And Joe passed away a long time ago, but that tells you a lot about, again, his integrity, his character, and like the family continuing that through. And then, we were really fortunate to be able to buy this from the Heitz family and be able to keep Brittany and the team in the cellar where, okay, they know we're just continuing. So I think Heitz is unique in its ability to have both black and red fruit in the same glass, because they tend to go in one direction or the other, but it has this tart red fruit with an under layer of sort of ripe, unctuous black fruit. And, Heitz has always used a little Limousin oak, which is the old school oak.
Right.
And if you look, Chateau Montelena at the time was using Limousin oak during the Paris tasting. So that Chardonnay from the tasting was aged in that same oak. Souverain used that same oak. It's very old school oak. So we still use a little Limousin because it's tradition here. And you see that peppered in, and what it does is it gives this sort of like sweet tobacco like characteristic to it. But I'd say, what is very impressive about this wine is it still has its core. I've been very fortunate to taste a lot of old wines, and I can guarantee you there are no 1970 Bordeaux's that taste this fresh and vibrant and unctuous and have so much weight. Like, this is a wine that we didn't decant it because, we're just enjoying it, but you could. I mean, it definitely has the weight to withstand that. But it's like that sweet, ripe cherry, but with tart red cherry as well. And that really sort of sweet tobacco characteristic that comes from like that peppered in Limousin oak.
Well, it's just beautiful. I mean, if you look at it, the clarity of it, and, being in this glass for, I don't know, it's been almost an hour or so, it's still just opening up and expressing itself. And I'm actually enjoying it even more now, which, again, wasn't decanted, but just to be able to be sitting here while we're having a great talk about, the old times
Yeah.
and the new times. But
you know, it's Martha's always has, you know, everyone talks about like the eucalyptus in Martha's. And I think you get a whole lot of that characteristic in the young wines, but in the old wines, it melds in sort of seamlessly. And it just turns into this really beautiful sort of herbaceousness,
Right.
like sage and rosemary, those sort of sappy herbs, like those winter herbs, when the wines are really old.
That's right.
And it's like very rosemary and pine. And the young wines is really sort of boisterous.
Yeah, no,
you
yeah.
know. But again, it all, you know, any great wine is nothing without acid. And, you know, this has a really great length on it, but it finishes with a fresh acid, which is really the goal, right? You know, I can just imagine like being over in the White House and like Alice is cooking and you have this and it's just like, you know, like what would Alice be cooking on a regular basis?
Well, she there's definitely proteins on the meat side, let me tell you that.
Yeah,
That
Joe
for
probably
sure.
wasn't like a sole and broccoli kind of guy. He was probably like big ribeye steaks.
There was definitely more of the red meat era, I think, going on here.
Yeah.
So yes, but again, I'm very impressed and thank you very much for the 1970 Martha's. It's beautiful, and I'm just like impressed how it's still just.
Here's to bringing back
up.
the old days.
That's right. Don't remind me.
They're coming back. We're bringing it back.
I know.